Welcome to Grow Money Business, the podcast dedicated to helping business owners grow both their wealth and business on their own terms. Here's your host, Grant Bledsoe.
Hello, everybody. Grant Bledsoe here. Welcome back to Grow Money Business. This week on the show, my guest is Mikkel Thorup. Mikkel is the founder of expatmoney.com and has a consulting advisory firm that helps people diversify their assets internationally. He helps people set up trusts and foundations in other countries, invest in other countries, and basically take assets out of the United States and place them elsewhere around the world. This was a fascinating conversation to me. I know very little about this kind of stuff. Every now and then we have someone in our financial planning firm who decides to move abroad or wants to put their assets abroad for some reason. The big takeaway that I got from this conversation is that there's no great mechanism to avoid U.S. taxation, unfortunately, in a legal manner. That being said, for anyone who's looking for asset protection or estate planning benefits of international diversification and stuff, this would be a great conversation to listen to. Mikkel is really experienced in this area and knows the specific nuances of a bunch of different countries, their legal systems, their banking systems, and how it all fits together internationally. I hope you enjoy the conversation too. Hey everyone, I need to interject quickly to remind you all that nothing found in today's episode or any other episode of Grow Money Business should be considered financial, investing, legal, tax, fitness, or even relationship advice. It's content that you're free to use and to deploy on your own terms. And before taking any actions on content found on the show, please do consult with your tax professional, your attorney, or your financial planner. If you don't have a financial planner, head on over to threeoakswealth.com to learn more about what we do in terms of financial planning and investments and how we help clients on an ongoing basis. There we go. I am here with Mikkel this week on the podcast. Mikkel, thank you for joining me.
Grant, very happy to be here.
Why don't we get started with this? Could you maybe give us a quick 30,000-foot introduction of what you do every day, what your background is, and what your life looks like?
Sure. So I work in the offshore markets. I specifically help high net worth individuals, mostly Americans and Canadians, to move overseas. We deal with their financial issues, their tax issues, a lot of immigration stuff. As for myself, I've been an expat for the last 22, almost 23 years now. I've circumnavigated the globe over 400 times. I've lived in 9 different countries, and I've visited somewhere around 110 countries in my life. I'm not a lawyer. I'm not a CPA. I'm an advisor or a consultant. I live this stuff in my personal life and my business at expatmoney.com, and work with all of these different clients to try to capture their objectives in kind of maybe a slightly different way than someone who works specifically in the domestic markets might do. So I don't really have anything. I don't have your experience, for example, on the domestic markets. I would always work with someone like you. You have an excellent service, but I specialize just in the international space.
Well, this is a topic I'm really excited to talk to you about today because we've not covered this on the podcast to date. We've had the show going for almost 3 years, like we were talking about here a few minutes ago, and we focus on helping business owners and entrepreneurs get the most out of their biggest asset and align their personal finances with their business. And every now and then, some international situation will come up. Somebody is moving abroad, or maybe has assets abroad, or wants to move assets abroad. And for the training and experience that I have here domestically in the U.S., none of it covers international stuff at all. And most of the planners and advisors in my sphere, when some international situation comes up, nobody wants to touch it with a 10-foot pole because it's something that nobody has any training on. It's a little treacherous, and you can get yourself into trouble and your clients into trouble if you don't know what you're talking about. So how did you get this experience? You're a really well-traveled dude. How did you learn all this stuff?
Yeah, so I'm completely self-taught. I'm what I describe as an autodidact polymath. I'm an expert in many different fields, and I'm self-taught, as I said. So I've studied intently, read well over 2,000 books on the subject of business and taxation and marketing and all of these types of things. I've also been very fortunate in my life. I've worked with some really fantastic lawyers over the years who took me under their wing and taught me a lot of different things, and I worked directly with them. And now we've been putting out our podcast, the Expat Money Show, for well over 6 years. I run an annual conference. I wrote a book about it. We have a blog with, I don't know, basically an article or 2 articles a day at expatmoney.com. So a ton of research for those types of things. And then really just doing it myself, being a giant guinea pig and getting different residencies and citizenships and buying real estate and investing in foreign markets and just going through it myself. I enjoy it. I think it's fun. I maybe have a high threshold for pain, I guess, with all the bureaucratic paperwork that is out there. But it's an itch that needs to be scratched by me, So I'm kind of a geek, and I just try to figure out all of these things piece by piece.
I would think that that's the only way that you can really learn. I mean, I like that you've had a couple of attorneys kind of take you under their wing and show you the ropes and all that, but the specifics of taxation country to country and the reciprocity of rules and friendly countries versus less friendly countries is unique to each specific geographic area, I would suspect. And that's probably the only way that you can learn it is by just reading a ton of stuff and trying to soak in as much as you can.
Yeah, absolutely. And you have to understand, though, that in the world, there's really 2 major systems that are out there. There's the United States, and then there's everywhere else on planet Earth. So the US kind of has a system that's like either you specialize in US or you specialize in everywhere else. Mine is I just specialize on the piece of removing people from the United States or Canada, and then what it looks like when we move them to a new country. Now, in that, I don't deal with every single one of the 193 countries. We're working with what would traditionally be known as tax havens or offshore jurisdictions. And really what this means is a country that has strong asset protection laws and is very tax favorable. So either they don't have an income tax or a corporate tax, or if they do, it's very, very low, or it's possible to mitigate it. So we deal with what we call the nearshore jurisdictions or the offshore jurisdictions.
And give us some examples of what countries we might be talking about.
Yeah. So as an example, I'm here in Panama. I have a home in Panama. Panama would be considered an offshore jurisdiction. They follow what's called the territorial tax system. So if your money is made outside of Panama, you're a consultant or you do Amazon FBA or drop shipping or any type of business on the internet, well, Panama doesn't really care about that, and they're not going to tax you. Now, that doesn't mean that you don't have a tax obligation to the United States. You absolutely do. As a U.S. citizen, it's your responsibility to pay taxes on your worldwide income. But this is one of the countries that we could say that we could use as an offshore jurisdiction. Other popular ones are the Caribbean countries. So you can think of like BVI, you can think of Belize, you can think about, all the ones that you might hear in the news where they say all the bad guys are hiding money. I just want to come straight out and just, it should be obvious, but I'm going to say it anyways. We always follow the letter of the law. We're not messing around in the gray zone or the black zone. Like, you can go and look up any of the rules, and anything that we're going to discuss today. I mean, you absolutely should talk to your CPA or a trusted professional who can give you advice, because I'm not going to give individual advice today, but yeah, there's lots of legal ways that we can do this.
So could you characterize the type of person that you're helping? You're the way you described it is you're helping Canadian and U.S. citizens leave the country, establish citizenship, residency somewhere else, and the intention is not just geographically to leave, it's to protect assets and reduce taxation on those assets, right? Is that the core reason for this?
Correct.
Add
to that, there's 2 other main drivers. I mean, taxation is certainly a big benefit. And, over the, leading up to the last 2.5 years, it was the main driver for a lot of people. Nowadays, there's a lot of people who don't like what's happening in North America, and they're looking for more freedom. So that is a big one. And the one that I always like to highlight, and I don't think enough other people highlight is that it's fun to live overseas and experience new cultures and meet new people and learn new languages and things like this. It's an adventure. And if you can do it with your family, it's an amazing experience to bring you all closer together. So I actually have a lot of families who are coming to me who want to experience something new. They want their children to have a more worldview opposed to just from one perspective. So it's kind of a combination of legal tax savings, a bit of adventure, and then if you are having to pay taxes, where that money goes and just having a little bit more control over it.
Sure. Okay. But what it doesn't sound like is if you have any kind of operation or business entity in the States or in Canada, it's not like you can pick up and move to Panama and avoid U.S. taxation on that business income. That's not what we're saying, right?
Okay, so there are ways that business owners can legally reduce their taxes. The big problem with people who come to me is they want to stay inside the United States and use the offshore markets to reduce their taxation. This is not going to do anything for them except make their lives a lot more complicated. It might help on the estate planning or the asset protection side, but from the taxation side, it actually just makes things really, really complicated. The main program that we usually work with people on and we try to set up from the very beginning for US citizens is called the Foreign Earned Income Exclusion, FEIE. And what it does is you get to exclude your first $112,000 of earned income. So basically that income is tax-free. You're not paying any tax on this. And I highly encourage you to go to the IRS website and you can look it up, FEIE, Foreign Earned Income Exclusion. Now, there's a couple of caveats with that. There's 2 tests, and you have to pass one of the tests to be able to go through this. So the first one is called the physical presence test. It's 330 days in a foreign country. This means that you cannot be sailing around the world. You can't be on a cruise. It doesn't mean, flying from New York to Paris and you get to count that. No, your feet physically have to be on the ground inside a foreign country. So we usually
any country, like 330
any
days,
country,
any
correct?
countries, yeah.
Any country, correct. So we usually do this year 1 because it's objective. It is mathematics, and if it's, if you don't hit the number of days, then that becomes very, very expensive. Now, the second option is called the Bona fide Residency Test, and we usually do this year 2. And we do it year 2 because it's a little bit more subjective. So it kind of helps to go through the process first, and you get accepted, and you fill out all your forms, you declare everything. You still declare your taxes, by the way. This is not, you don't have to declare. You have to declare everything. And the way that we do the bona fide residency test is we would get you a physical residency somewhere else, which is the legal right to live and work in another country. And then we would draw strong ties to that country. So if you go to church, then, participating in the local church or synagogue or mosque. If you play sports, then a gym membership or a club membership for footy. Your driver's license, bank accounts, all of these types of things that draw a strong tie to the country. This will allow you to spend slightly more time back in the United States. I don't want to give a definitive answer on how many days because, once again, it's completely subjective. But the point is that you live in another country. That is where your life is. That's where everything is. And then you go back and you see your friends and family on vacation in the States. But for all of these types of things, you really have to leave. Like that's kind of the linchpin on these things. You have to leave. Now, earlier I said it's $112,000, which is a good amount of money. Most people can have a very nice life, even inside the United States, $112,000. But when you start spending that money in Costa Rica or Belize or Panama or these types of countries where the cost of living might be half the amount, and you're doing that tax-free, well, that's pretty amazing. And if you're married and your spouse is also an American citizen, it's a doubling effect. So it can actually be the first almost $225,000 of tax-free income. If you're going above that, then there's foreign housing credits and foreign tax credits, and there's other tools in the toolbox. But for today's conversation, I think it's worth just kind of, explaining to you about the foreign earned income exclusion, because it usually does help quite a bit of people.
Sure. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Now, you mentioned estate planning and asset protection benefits as well. Let's go over those. And I assume what you're talking about is asset protection, meaning shielding assets from creditors, from liability. Estate planning, meaning avoiding the estate tax if you live in a state that has an estate tax, or if the state is worth a substantial amount, there is a federal estate tax too. Can you walk us down that road too?
Sure, it's all of those things, but there's even more. So I'll give you a concrete example. So let's say you decide that you want to start investing internationally, and you have a condo in Panama and some agricultural land in Uruguay, and some precious metals in Singapore, and a beach villa in Costa Rica. Okay, you've got properties or assets or accounts in 3 or 4 different countries. So from the estate planning side, something happens to you. You get hit by the proverbial bus, and now your family, your heirs, have to go to each one of these countries and go through their probate and their court system and argue that the assets belong to you. So you can make things a little bit easier by having a last will and testament in each one of these countries. But when you start dealing with 3, 4, 5 different countries and keeping everything up to date with all of those countries, that makes it really tricky. A much easier solution is to have everything in what we would call like an asset protection trust, or what I really like these days is the Panama Private Interest Foundation. So most people will recognize a foundation as a charitable giving foundation, but Panama has one that's based off of the Liechtenstein or the Swiss foundation style. So it's a civil law structure that allows you to get the assets out of your own name. It's similar to a trust in a lot of ways, except you get to administer it. So you don't need to have a trustee. And in there, you can have all your beneficiaries listed. So, if something happens to me, it goes to my spouse. If something happens to my spouse, it goes to my natural born children. And this percentage goes to my favorite charity, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Now, you don't have to go through the probate system in each one of these countries if something like that happens. They are the beneficial owner of the trust or the foundation, and that's it. It saves a lot of time and energy and effort and really stress for your family if something happens to you. Does all that make sense?
It makes sense to me, but this Panamanian foundation, you're saying that is recognized in Costa Rica and in Singapore. Correct. And other countries?
Yeah, so basically the foundation owns the share certificates of any other business or any other properties as long as it is bought in the name of the foundation. So as you're setting it up, you're transferring assets in, or you buy the assets underneath the name of the foundation in the first place, and that's it. There's no probate. You're completely skipping probate.
And so how does Singapore coordinate with Panama? If you have, I think your example was, precious metals or something like that, sitting in Singapore in the name of this Panamanian foundation, you get hit by the bus. Singapore is going to say, holy smokes, Mikkel has these assets named in this Panamanian foundation. Therefore, we're just going to let the Panamanian law rule. Where do those two things coordinate?
So that's not quite right. What would happen is, in this example, the account in Singapore would not be named, would not be opened under your name if you were the beneficiary, or my name if I was the beneficiary. It would actually be named under the foundation. So the foundation would be 123 Coconut Foundation. Okay, so there's no transfer. The account holder or the account providers in Singapore, in this example, would not even need to know that anything has changed, because there's no transfer. The assets are still owned by the foundation. They were originally owned by the foundation. They continue to be owned by the foundation. Now, just the beneficiary has changed. Now, usually we're using nominee services. So basically, a treasurer and a president and a director of the foundation. It also helps a lot with privacy. So it will keep the person's name off these things. And then you can have a POA with the foundation, so you can sign on its behalf, or you just bring any documents or account opening to the nominee service, and they sign the documents for you.
Interesting. So just to translate for everybody out there, we're brushing through things here pretty quickly, but one really common estate planning technique that's particularly popular in California, if you own a house and you've talked to an estate planning attorney, they've probably recommended that you set up what's called a living trust. And you put the house inside the trust, you name a beneficiary, you get full use of the house during your lifetime. If there are taxable events, Those are passed to you, the individual, as grantor and trustee. And then when you die, the assets in the trust can be distributed by the successor trustee, whoever takes over for you, without going through probate. And that's really helpful and important, particularly in California, because it takes forever to go through probate. It's public, it's expensive, and if you're setting things up for the benefit of your beneficiaries or your heirs, your intention is probably going to be to get those assets in their hands as quickly and efficiently as possible. And so what I hear you saying, Mikkel, is that this Panamanian structure is it's a Panamanian foundation, but because of a nuance of Panamanian law, you can set up this foundation and also be a trustee during your lifetime, whereas that's not available to you in a U.S. foundation. So you structure this thing in Panama. This Panamanian foundation owns assets around the world and achieves the same purpose. It just is all routed through Panama.
Correct. Yeah.
What did I get wrong in that explanation there? Is that about right?
I think that you got the majority of the things correct. You have to understand that the differences between a trust and a foundation are namely that a trust is a common law structure, so it's based on English common law. So you would actually have a trustee. With the foundation, it's a civil law, so it comes from the Napoleonic Code, and it's just a little bit different. It's just a little bit easier with all of these things. It gives you a lot more flexibility, although probably technically, it's not quite as safe, some people say, as an offshore trust, because you're still the beneficiary. Now, after doing this for many, many years, I've not seen any types of problems with it. And I think that it's just much easier to go about a foundation. We used to do Cook Island Trust. We used to do Belize Trusts, lots of other offshore ones. They end up being really expensive and kind of overkill for most people. Unless you're like really, I don't know what you would be doing that you really need that kind of level of removing yourself from things. But I think that the Panamanian Private Interest Foundation is kind of the best of both worlds. And it's affordable. Like we've done these in Switzerland and stuff like that. And the legal fees will be $70,000, $60,000 to set it up, which means you really have to have like an extraordinary net worth to kind of get these going. With the Panama Foundation, it's not a tenth of that, but maybe a fifth of that, or maybe a little bit less, so it's still, if you have $1 million, $2 million in assets and you're starting to diversify internationally, then it is a very good solution.
Interesting. Yeah, and you answered my next question. That was going to be all these other offshore areas that you mentioned earlier, Belize, Cook Islands, Cayman Islands, probably in there too. Mm-hmm. All have similar structures, but the cost of getting things up and running there is prohibitive in most circumstances.
Yeah, I would say that's correct.
Interesting. Okay. So your consulting firm, it sounds like you guys arrange these types of structures for people. Do you contract with local attorneys to have them drawn up? How does all that work?
Yeah, so I work in what's kind of a family office style, if you're familiar with that, or shared family office or virtual family office style. So as I said earlier, I'm not a lawyer. I have full-time lawyers that work for me. We've got a pretty decent sized staff down here, but I partner with a lot of lawyers and CPAs, and everything that we plan out, I get them to sign off on. First of all, I want to make sure that my client is protected. And second of all, I don't want the liability myself. So everything is always done through a lawyer. We have the relationships with them in probably about 20, 22 different countries that I work in. As I said earlier in the conversation, mostly the offshore jurisdictions. And this doesn't just go for the structures, which we've been discussing, but this is also residencies, citizenship, precious metal vaults, brokerage accounts, all of these types of things. We help clients get everything set up. So I work with the client right from the very beginning. We develop a plan. It's kind of a discovery phase. We'll take 3 or 4 calls together. We'll go through everything, and then I'll start building the team, because there is no human being on planet Earth who knows every single jurisdiction, every single field. I mean, I know a lot. Like I have studied a ridiculous amount and have been in a lot of situations, but I still need to have things checked with a lawyer and have them sign off on it. So I kind of QB on these things and build a team of the half a dozen lawyers and CPAs that we need. And then we start building it.
Very cool. So who would you say is a good candidate for a structure like that?
Yeah, I think, well, I can tell you who typically is my client. So kind of the $2 to $10 million net worth range really makes sense. If you're looking at 400 or 500, even $1 million, I mean, at $1 million, it might make sense, but you're probably going to feel it. I mean, there's a lot of costs that are involved. And we should always be a value add. So what I like to tell my clients is you might pay me, but it will never cost you anything. If we're doing our job correctly, either, by tax savings or putting you into investments that you might not have seen before, or even just keeping you away from fraudulent people and some of the sharks that are out there, making sure that you're working with sound people, doing things legally. I know I've had to say this 20 times, but I really want to stress this point. There's a lot of mistakes that can happen out there, and you need to work with someone that you trust to make sure that you're compliant and stay legal, especially Americans, because it's very, very complex from the US side.
Yeah, and I have to imagine as soon as you start talking about cross-border stuff, the universe of scammers opens exponentially, which is, of course, always an issue in today's day and age. Where do
Yeah.
people screw this up? What can you get wrong?
Well, okay. So the first thing that I said, the first what I want to mention is what I said earlier. People want to create offshore jurisdictions, and then they are offshore companies in an offshore jurisdiction, and just think, "Hey, I'm going to move my assets into that, and now I don't own it, and IBC owns it, or an LLC owns it, or an offshore trust owns it, and therefore I don't need to pay tax on it in the United States." No, wrong. They're not stupid. They have thought of this. You still have to declare, and if you don't declare, there's massive fines and there's possible jail time for these types of things. So you really, really have to be careful. There's also FATCA. So you have to file what's called an FBAR. FATCA actually comes from the banking side, and the way it works is if you have any offshore accounts or any accounts really outside of the United States, this can be bank accounts, brokerage accounts, paper gold, ETFs, mutual funds, anything like this. And in aggregate over a 12-month period, it reaches more than 10,000 US dollars. It needs to be submitted. Now, this doesn't go to the IRS. This actually goes to the Treasury Department, but this needs to be done. This is not something you want to mess around with. There's massive fines and huge problems if you're not doing this. Now, in my experience of doing this for many years, your local CPA who works down at H&R Block is not going to know what your filing requirements are when you go offshore. So you really, really, really want to work with a specialist who specializes in cross-border transactions, with working with expats, working in the offshore markets. So it's kind of like going to a doctor. You're not going to go to your GP for brain surgery. You need to go to someone who specializes in this exact field and work with them. It costs more, but in the long run, it will actually cost you a lot less because you're not going to get into trouble. I don't mean to scare everyone off here. I know this is probably terrible. I'm kind of beating you over the head with this, but I just want to be very, very clear up front.
No, that part should be obvious. I would hope. There's a lot of good local tax professionals around there. There's a lot of good local financial planners. There's planners, the stuff that I do here around, but very, very few of us have any idea what we're doing with regards to international transactions. And you definitely need people on your team who understand that and can guide you safely and properly, because the fines are massive. And the FATCA, reporting that $10,000 threshold aligns with, if you're flying internationally, they want you to report if you have more than $10,000 in cash on you. That's the same kind of reporting, right? And we see these, the Wolf of Wall Street movies where people take a bunch of cash over to Switzerland and they get in all sorts of trouble for it. It's because that they were not reporting properly and paying tax on that cash, right? So lots of pitfalls, it's interesting to hear you put it in these terms. I think a lot of people jump to the conclusion that if I get my assets offshore, it's going to save me in taxation. Is there a possibility of that at all? If you're physically moving offshore, you get your assets offshore and you sever your ties to the United States, what actually has to happen for you to avoid U.S. taxation?
So these are the things that I was talking about before with the foreign earned income exclusion, and we can dive back into that a little bit. So actually, in this case, it doesn't really matter where your income is generated from the US standpoint. What they care about more than anything is where you are. So as long as you have left the States and you are filing, then you're going to be able to qualify, keeping in mind all of those caveats that I made before, which I'm not going to repeat. But you can still have US bank accounts, you can still have US Social Security, you can still have all of these types of things. But as long as you are out of the country, then you are legally allowed to claim these things.
Gotcha. Okay. Can you explain the difference between citizenship and residency? And if you're someone who's considering all this, say, you're picking out some country to spend 330 days a year in order to exclude 100, what was the threshold, 112,000
Correct. Yeah.
of income?
In today's, it keeps up with inflation, but in 2022, then yes.
112,000 this year. It'll be a little bit more next year. How do you go about that, citizenship and residency wise?
Sorry, can you repeat that? My daughter
No
just started
problem.
screaming there.
Well,
This
you were
will need
quick
to
on
edit out. I
Uh,
muted myself.
that's okay. You were quick on the mute button. I didn't hear anything.
Okay. The joys of a dynamic microphone.
So let's say that you're considering going somewhere, some foreign country, for the purpose of excluding $112,000 of income. You're in Panama. I imagine you could do this anywhere as long as you meet the 330-day threshold. What do you have to put in place? Do you have to become a resident? Do you have to have a passport? How do you obtain a passport? Is this a visa situation? How are those factors involved?
Sure. So, okay, let's tackle the question of what is a residency, what is a citizenship. We'll dive into that first, and I think that a lot of other things will kind of become clear afterwards. So, a residency, and specifically when I say residency, what I'm referring to is a permanent residency. That is usually the goal. That's certainly the things that we deal with at my firm. So, I'm not dealing with student visas or work visas or these types of things. I'm dealing with permanent residencies. And what this means is you have the legal right to live and work in that country. Okay. Now, the difference between a residency and a citizenship is kind of the next step. This is when you can say, like, I am Brazilian, or I am Argentinian, or I am Panamanian, or whatever it might be. The additional things that come with this are, if you were so inclined, you could serve in the military, the armed forces. If you were politically motivated, you could vote. And the other big one, and the one that actually people think of first, is the passport. So a passport is really just a travel document. It's a piece of paper, which is the physical agreement of one country to another. So that's what you're paying for. That's what you're getting with a lot of these types of things. So it's, does a citizen of this country have the legal right to travel and spend time in a foreign country? The governments go back and forth. They negotiate over these types of things, and you have that. Now, as a resident, you're not going to get a passport. You're only going to have the right to live and work in that country. So, you get your Costa Rican residency. You can come and spend time in Costa Rica, but you can't use a Costa Rican passport because you don't have that right to come to Panama. But if you become a Costa Rican citizen, you get the passport. Now you can travel around the world on that passport. So the next question is, well, why does someone want to do these types of things? Well, if you were to go to Costa Rica and you did not have a residency or a citizenship, you're going to be able to spend a certain amount of time in that country. I would say it's probably about 90 days. Let's say it's 90 days. It could be 180 because I don't memorize every single travel visa. But at some point, you're going to need to leave the country. and that's fine. You can go on to a neighboring country, you can move somewhere else. But what we saw during COVID is a lot of the countries locked down, and they locked down for all tourists, but they didn't lock down for residents or citizens, meaning that you still had the right to cross borders. Okay. There's other advantages as well. Some countries you can buy real estate as a foreigner. Other countries you need to be a resident or a citizen. Same with bank accounts, same with corporate structures, same with brokerage accounts, yada, 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 yada. These types of things. Also, you could end up losing your primary passport. So if you had a second passport, you are now not stuck in one country. You could travel out with that. If your passport were to get canceled, which was what we're seeing in Lebanon right now, a lot of people, their passports expired and the government is no longer reissuing passports, and all of the people are stuck in the country. And that's a big nightmare. We're seeing this with many places in Europe right now, closing of the borders because of the wars. So having these types of backup documents and second residencies can give you a lot more flexibility, a lot more mobility, and protect your assets in a way that you yourself are your greatest asset, your ability to generate income and build something and create with your own two hands. So it kind of touched on or tackled a couple of different things. First of all, does all of that make sense? And then we can kind of go in any direction you like.
Yeah, it does. It does make sense. As you can probably surmise, I'm not nearly as well traveled as you are. I spent most of my free time growing up and through my 20s playing baseball, and all summers and evenings, weekends, and so I didn't have an opportunity to travel as much internationally as I think a lot of my friends and peers growing up. And so a lot of this is new to me, and I know you're probably explaining it for the 10,000th time this month so far. What happens logistically if you're visiting a country? They have a 90-day limit. If you're on vacation in Costa Rica and you just decide not to take your flight home, how realistically are they going to find you and boot you out of the country?
So what would happen is, not in all cases, but I can give you a couple of scenarios. So most likely you could overstay your visa, but then when you go to leave, you go to the airport and you show your passport, they'll be able to very, very clearly see that you've overstayed your visa. Then you're going to be escorted to a little room and they're going to sit you down and try to find out what happened. There's most likely going to be a fine. Every country has a different amount. So you would pay the fine. But more than that, you would get a blackball stamp in your passport that you've overstayed your visa. And this can affect you for years and years afterwards. I am very happy to say that in 22 years of doing this and visiting well over 100 countries, I have never been through this process myself. I like to go through a lot of the processes, but I like to keep it on the positive side. I'm also very different than a lot of digital nomads because they often get themselves into trouble with these types of things. They'll do border runs, they'll go back and forth, they'll overstay visas. I don't like these things. I like to keep legal and compliant on everything. It just lets me sleep a lot better at night. So if you have the residency, then you don't have to worry. You can spend 5 years in the country and never have to leave. And it doesn't matter. You have complete control over everything. So that's kind of a way that you will probably get caught. Now, there's other possibilities. You're driving in the country and there's a police checkpoint checking for drunk drivers and you have to show your ID and you don't have a national ID. So you have to show your passport. And then they kind of see, hey, wait a second, what's going on? And they make a couple of phone calls. That's kind of a possibility as well. If you go to set up utilities or you try to get rental agreements or anything like that, there's just so many ways that you could get busted for these types of things. So I really don't suggest it by any means.
Right. Interesting. So your office helps with a lot of direct foreign investments too, right? In international companies and types of things. What is your general philosophy and strategy, and how do you source these opportunities for people that come into your office?
Sure. So the way that I like to do all of the types of investments, first of all, I'm very much a hard money kind of guy, tangible assets. We're usually looking to pair these types of things with a residency. So earlier I explained the difference between a residency or citizenship, but we didn't really get into how you get them. One of the best strategies for getting these is through real estate. So every country will have their own program, but a very common one will be the purchase of real estate, and on the back of the real estate, showing it as an economic tie to the country and getting your residency or your citizenship there. So those are usually the types of investments and FDI that I work with in a country, is on the real estate side, so that we can get the residencies and citizenships.
Right. And that makes sense. If you're venturing into this field for the first time, there's often, I think in the United States, a bias toward tangible assets, because if you have two things that have the exact same investment merits and return expectations, if you can see and touch and feel one of them, people naturally like that a little bit more. It's tangible, right? And the less tangible stuff we kind of veer away from, even if the investment merits might be a little bit greater than a tangible thing that's down the street from our house. That being said, if you're venturing into a foreign country and a new geographical area for the first time, I can absolutely see how you'd be a little more comfortable with the tangible stuff first, given that maybe you're trying to establish residency there, you spend 330 days a year there. Even so, an intangible asset in a new area of the world is a little bit of a scary proposition. Do you ever get into that stuff at all, or does it solely stick on the tangible side?
I do certainly. I mean, we work with a lot of hedge funds, hedge funds based out of Switzerland and things like that. The second part of your question, which I didn't answer, and I apologize, I will answer now, is I really do a ton of due diligence with everybody that I work with. And I usually am getting professional referrals from people that I trust. So I'll work with a lawyer, I'll need a contact in such and such country. They'll make an introduction. They'll vouch for that person. Then I will go over and I will meet with them. We'll spend time together. We'll look at the financials. We'll look at the balance sheet. We'll do a little bit of due diligence on the person. And then a lot of times I'm doing the investments myself first. So there might be a 6 month or a year lead time before I would ever bring it to my clients, because I want to go through it. I want to make sure that it's legit, because my greatest asset is my name. Like, you can go on Google, you can go and look me up, Mikkel Thorup, go look up expatmoney.com. I have a stellar reputation, but that's because I take this stuff really, really, really seriously. And I know you get exactly one mistake in this industry, and then that's it. So you got to be like absolutely paranoid with everything. And I would rather say no to 10 deals and then take a chance on just even one of them that I wasn't sure on.
Yeah. Your credibility in your space is massive. So the geographic location of these tangible investment, real estate, whatever, is driven by the desire for residence and citizenship often. Are you doing any kind of analysis on local economic factors and what the currency is doing? That's a huge factor of international return on investment. Or is it just simply, we want to establish residency in Belize, find us a Belize investment that looks good?
So it's more of the former, because first of all, I'm going to choose jurisdictions that I will work on or work in based on the merits of that country. What are the laws like? What is the inflation like? What is the currency like? What is the banking like? How does everything fit together? Then it's about the team. Do I have trusted professionals that I can work with there? Are things going to go smooth? Is it, what is the bureaucracy? I've done a ton of work in Brazil, and it has been an absolute nightmare with the bureaucratic work there. I've been through the process myself, and I don't want to send clients there because it's just too much. It's absolutely too much. But I can give you a real life example. So I had a couple of private clients who came to me and they said, we've been hearing some good things about Uruguay. What do you know about Uruguay? And I said, well, not a lot, to be honest. So I reached out to a lawyer that I work with or a professional I worked with, and got a professional referral down to a law firm in Uruguay. took a call with the CEO, met him. He introduced me to the head of the tax department, the head of the immigration department, the head of their investing firm. It's a 95-person law firm. It's pretty good size. They then flew their CEO up to Panama. I spent a half a day with him building the relationship. Then he invited my wife and I down to Uruguay. So we flew into Montevideo, spent a week there, breakfast, lunch, and dinner, went to the office, saw the real estate, saw everything ourselves, started learning about the currencies, about the inflation, how are things held, what is the government like, what is the political situation, all of these types of things. Okay, the whole trip cost me probably 15 or 20 grand to put together, but that's the type of due diligence that I would do. Now, at the end of this, Uruguay does look like a very good country, and consequently, I'm bringing 20 of my private clients down in a couple of weeks for a trip there to look at everything to invest. Like, I'm considering doing, and I have to do a tiny bit more due diligence, but we should be doing a 7-figure investment there ourselves in agricultural land. Now, compare that to my example of Brazil, which was too much paperwork. I went through the process and, it was just an absolute nightmare. Well, I'm not going to send people there because of these reasons, because the real, the local currency, loses its value, because we have an election coming up, and Lula could get back in and Bolsonaro will be out, and what will that mean for the country? So there's all this geopolitical and economic things that need to be understood before we'll ever look at moving assets there.
Right. Interesting. So circling back to one of our previous questions, how do you, if you're interested in one of these new countries, you're not really ready to make a direct investment, you'd like to spend some time there. Outside of purchasing real property, how does one get residency or citizenship?
So that's kind of a difficult question to answer, because every single country will have its own laws and rules surrounding immigration. So Panama, for example, we have something like 22 different residency programs here. Now, which one is right for you? Which one is right for your family? I mean, that would be something that we would really need to explore and we would need to dive into. So, it's not like every country has one program and that's it, and it applies to everybody. It's kind of the opposite. It's like every country could have an immigration process or might have one. What does it look like? Do you qualify? How difficult is it to get done? How much is the time frame? What are your goals and objectives? What are the tax implications of you getting residency there or citizenships? How do we navigate all of these things? So it's kind of, I don't mean to be dodge the question, but it's just really, it's just too much to go through, or maybe not possible to explain everything on it.
Sure. No, that's a fair response. Well, Mikkel, this has been really fascinating. What have we not touched on yet that's relevant to people you typically work with?
Well, I think that you've done a great job to kind of uncover a lot of different aspects of the offshore jurisdiction. So we kind of talked about the reasons why someone might want to do this. The taxation, that's one reason, but also a bit of fun and adventure. Also, if you don't agree with the political direction that your country's going in, a lot of people are making changes because of that, as well as, extra freedom, a bit more personal responsibility, not being in a nanny state, not being in a state which is heavily surveilled. So, cameras on every street corner, and everything you're watching is, everything you're doing is being watched, being treated more like an adult, those are all reasons why. We talked about the differences between residencies and citizenships, how these all function, the ways to get it, the tax structures, your obligations to the US, a little bit on the tax obligations to one of the offshore jurisdictions. And then what else did we cover? The Panama Private Interest Foundation and the structures. I'd say that's a pretty good background or breakdown in an hour's conversation of how everything fits together. If you guys are curious about more of these types of things, then we're actually hosting a summit. It's from November 7th to 11th. You guys can pick up a free ticket at expatmoneysummit.com. There's a VIP ticket option if you want to get like a ton of bonuses and stuff like that. But if not, just come and grab the free ticket and check out what we do. And, it kind of picks up the conversation, Grant, where you and I are leaving off, and really goes into depth on every single one of these things for an hour plus. So it's really a deep dive on each individual one, plus all the different jurisdictions and countries and things that we just didn't have time today to talk about. So that's at expatmoneysummit.com.
Very cool. Very cool. Well, thank you, Mikkel, for your time and expertise here. Expatmoney.com. What's the name of your podcast?
Expat Money Show. So if you guys go to Google Podcasts, Apple Podcasts, basically anywhere popular podcasts are down, type in Expat Money Show, you'll find my program there. We've been going for over 6 years, so well over 200 episodes and going strong.
Right on. Well, keep up the good work. This has been fascinating to me, and I really appreciate your time and joining me today.
Pleasure's all mine. Thanks so much, Grant.
Thanks for tuning in to Grow Money Business, the podcast dedicated to helping business owners grow both their wealth and business on their own terms. Be sure to subscribe to the podcast on iTunes, Google Play, or wherever you digest podcasts to ensure you don't miss out on future episodes and announcements. And feel free to submit questions to growmoneybusiness.com.